Welcome to the Law School Toolbox Podcast. Today we're discussing what we think you should focus on academically in your first weeks of law school. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, the Catapult Conference, and Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about 5 things to focus on academically in the first month of law school. If you're just starting out in law school, this episode is for you. All right, so you've gone through orientation and now you're in the middle of classes. So typically your first semester, you're going to take a handful of substantive classes and your legal research and writing. So Lee, what's the first thing that you recommend to incoming law students to make sure that they get off on the right foot?
Well, it may seem silly, but you need to keep up with your reading. I mean, one of the things that I think law students really underestimate is how much time it takes, especially in those early days when you're still getting used to reading case law, how slow that reading can go.
Yes, absolutely. I was just talking with a potential tutoring student about this today, in fact, and I said, one of the things you really got to keep an eye on is if you dig yourself a hole in the beginning by not getting your reading done, that is a hole you're never going to be able to climb out of. So it might seem like in those first weeks, like, I'll just not read a case or two and catch up later. But I think that's a really terrible idea.
I think that's true. And I think, it used to be probably your undergraduate academic experience that if you got behind, you could just catch up. But it is really impossible to catch up on reading once you're behind.
Yeah, I think it just becomes a downward spiral. It's not the sort of thing where, maybe if you get sick for one day and you don't do your reading for a couple of classes, yes, you can probably catch up. If you're really serious about it, you can catch up that weekend by, not going to the gym and spending 3 or 4 hours doing your reading. But just the sheer volume is so high that if you miss more than a couple of days, that's not a hole you're going to be out of. Yeah.
And I think students, when they get that reading assignment before the first day of classes, which you'll probably get, some people think, oh, that's optional, right? No.
Yeah, I think that's a really big difference, too, is that in law school, it's not like, the first day of class is like, hey, let's get acquainted and here's the syllabus and this is what we're going to be talking about. You're expected to actually be ready to go. You might get called on day one.
Exactly. And that's not to intimidate you. It's just that you're supposed to give it a try. And I know that we've written a lot about this on blog posts and talked about it in other podcasts, but this idea that although reading can sometimes be boring, and we'll be honest, it can be very boring, it is actually, teaching you legal analysis. You are learning by reading the cases. So even if it does feel like it's slow and a bit laborious in the beginning because you don't know what words mean and the language may be a little archaic, I do think it's rough those first few weeks of school. You oftentimes are reading really old cases with very old English, but you are learning this skill of legal analysis and how to learn not only how to take the law from a case, but also how to think about cases and how legal reasoning works, which is what you're going to need to know how to do for an exam.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. Sometimes people think like, I can just read the case briefs and that'll give me enough information, like the Cliff Note version, like maybe you did in undergrad. But I think the key thing, and I had someone I knew in law school who ended up failing the bar multiple times. And when I asked her why, one of the things she said was, well, I didn't really learn how to read a case in the beginning. And so I relied really heavily on case briefs and outlines and things like that to get through school. But what I now realize is there was all this osmosis that was supposed to be taking place where I was really learning how to do legal analysis and what it was supposed to sound like by reading these cases. And when I skipped doing that, I just wasn't getting that background.
Mm-hmm. It's a whole different debate about whether the case method and the Socratic method is the most efficient way to learn, but it is.
I would say no.
But it is there for a reason, and you can learn something by doing your reading and struggling. And I think this idea of getting comfortable with the struggle, if you haven't listened to it yet, we have a great podcast we did very, very early on in the podcast on mindset and why that's so important in law school. But, you really have to be able to struggle with this material and grow from that struggle and see it as a learning opportunity, and not just start to read a case and be like, oh my gosh, this is way too hard, I'm just going to not do it.
Right. So basically you're saying it builds character.
It does build character. Yes. Yes, it does.
You're building your legal character by suffering through these early cases. But the good news is eventually things will kind of fall into place, and you won't have to look up every, fifth word in the dictionary to understand what a case means. And you want to get to that point as soon as possible. And the way to do that is by doing your reading diligently and making a good faith effort in the beginning, so that you get yourself to a point where you're like, oh, I understand the basic procedural posture. I know what summary judgment means. Mm-hmm. You don't want to be that person who at the end of, your second year is I've never heard of voir dire. What is that? Or,
right.
Any of these things where it's just you probably should have read a case that had that in it, probably several of them.
Right. And I think students don't realize, too, that it is a learned skill. By the time you're a 3L, you'll be cranking through cases, reading them much more efficiently. You can read much faster. You know what to take notes on so you can remember. It's not like a foreign language to you. But in the beginning, the struggle is real because that's how you learn, and it's supposed to be that way.
Yeah, and a lot of it is just at this point, if you're in your first few weeks of law school, you have no idea what matters.
Right.
You or I could take a case and basically skim through probably, a quarter to a third of it without really paying that much attention, because we know that is not that relevant.
Right, exactly. And one of the things you're also trying to figure out in these first few weeks of class as it relates to your reading is what your professor thinks is important in each of these cases. You should be listening in class about the questions, the same types of questions they ask over and over again. My criminal law professor always wanted somebody to explain to him what the government's arguments were and then what the defendant's arguments were. So those had to be called out in my briefs or marked up on the case because I knew that question was coming. Someone was going to have to answer that question. And so you also need to be thoughtful when you're doing the reading that it's not just this intellectual exercise, but you're also preparing for class, and you want to be looking for the information that your professor is likely to ask you about. Some professors love policy. They love talking about policy, and if a case talks about policy, you better highlight it, make a star by it, because it's probably going to come up in class.
Yeah, exactly. You're not doing this reading in a box.
No.
And I think that's another key point to take away from the reading is one of the things you need to be asking yourself with all these cases you're reading is, why am I reading this? Why was this assigned? And that sort of takeaway is what we're looking for. We're not reading these for our own information. We're not reading these to find out that Mr. John Doe had a dog and they lived in wherever and the dog got eaten by a snake. No one cares.
Right.
That's not the point of this. So part of this is a process, like I said, of really learning what matters and what's important. And I think that leads us into our step number 2 for what you need to be doing, which you have actually alluded to, which is it's really important to pay attention in class.
Yeah, this might seem like a no-brainer, but sometimes class is going to be boring. We'll just warn you, some professors are boring, some professors aren't very good. But if you...
Or it can be really confusing.
But the worst thing you can do is get online and start checking email or reading blog posts or chatting with your friends and not paying attention, because you're actually spending a ton of money just for the privilege of sitting in that class. And
that's what I was going to say. Go ahead and calculate your hourly cost for being in that class, because I'm going to probably guess it's several $100s.
Yeah. So you might as well, listen and write some stuff down and pay attention. I also think another thing that students discredit in class is that if you pay attention in class and actually try and learn from the professor, the rest of your studying is going to be more productive. Not paying attention in class and then taking some cryptic class notes that you've taken and then trying to go study that material after class when you weren't really dialed into what was happening in class, that's very slow. It's not an efficient way to study. Class serves a purpose, and you should get something out of it.
Yeah, and I think it's worthwhile to. Oh, I see. This is actually our next point. Okay, it's worthwhile to try different methods of note taking, and I think that in terms of paying attention in class, you're right. Like, you want to pay attention, but you also need to record what's going on for later use. And by record, let me be clear, I do not mean you should record the lecture and listen to it again. In almost no cases is that a useful use of your time. Maybe in a few very unusual cases, I can make the case for that. But typically speaking, you want to go once and get something out of it. But then you need to think about, how am I going to use this information later? Like, what am I taking away with me?
One of the other things that we often see can be really helpful for students is actually to go old school and try handwriting notes instead of typing. So there are a few reasons for this. One is we are all so addicted to the internet that it is practically impossible for us to not multitask on our laptops. So that is definitely point number one. And the other thing is there's a lot of research, a lot of articles, we'll link to some of them in the show notes, about how note-taking on the computer doesn't really lead to retention. And handwriting notes uses different parts of the brain. You have muscle memory. It really allows stuff to stick in your brain better. And why wouldn't you want your class notes to stick in your brain better? Because that is, why you're there. And so if you haven't taken handwritten notes in years, or you think that sounds really bizarre, we really encourage you to just try it for a few class periods, or even try it for a few different classes and see if it really makes a difference. A lot of students say it makes a really big difference. If I was going to go back and do law school again, I would absolutely handwrite all of my classes.
I think that's right. I mean, you'll be almost alone in that sea of laptops. But my law school roommate did that actually in her second year, and she said it was life-changing. Mm-hmm. Because she could doodle, she could have colors, she could do all these different things that she couldn't do when she was distracted on the computer just typing. And I mean, I think it can be and often is a distraction to type in a way that jotting down a few words in a note is not necessarily. I mean, think if you're in a meeting, it's pretty easy to take notes on a notepad. It's incredibly rude, basically, to be taking notes on your laptop because you're really not paying attention. Yep. And, I think there's some sort of developed methods of note-taking, like the Cornell method. I think we have a piece on we can link to. But, people have thought about this. Mm-hmm. And they've thought about the best way to do notes. And their tools, almost like you've got software, you've actually got all kinds of different notebooks you can use. I mean, we personally are obsessed with the Circa notebooks. But part of the reason is they have this piece on the side where it corresponds really nicely to the Cornell note-taking method. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to, it's not just like you have to go in with your yellow notepad and that's all you can use. There are actually some pretty sophisticated note-taking by hand tools that you can be using in class.
For sure. I mean, I've seen students do really effective things to either using a Circa notebook or a binder where they will have, the case brief even printed out if they decided they wanted to print the case brief that they might have written or the notes they took on the brief, on the left-hand side, like if something's opened up as a book, and then you take notes on that case on the right-hand side, and then you flip over to the next page, you've got the next brief that you guys covered in class, and then the notes about that brief on the next page. I mean, there are just so many ways that you can experiment to really, annotate either the notes that you made when you were reading the case, or to really clarify things, cross things out that are wrong. I mean, you just have so much more freedom. Also, I always found it interesting that the professors would still draw diagrams and things on the board, especially in classes like property or when you have multiple parties, like in contracts. They always love arrows, like pointing to different parties here and there. And you can't recreate that on a laptop unless you want to do some drawing program, and you don't have time to do that in class. So you're going to lose something in the translation.
It's funny. I remember I was working with a student in property once, and he says to me oh, it's okay to draw a diagram. I was like, how in the world are you going to figure out who all these people are otherwise? You need a family tree here. This is crazy. He's like, oh, because I thought that would be useful, but I didn't think it was very lawyerly. Yeah. I was like, God, have you been to court? It's all about,
it's all about
this
diagrams.
Information. Yeah. So I think it does give you flexibility. But even if you decide you want to take your notes on the laptop, I mean, number one, your goal should not be to transcribe the lecture.
Right.
That's, that's the equivalent of basically listening to the class again.
Yeah.
You've got to extract the information and extract what's important. And if you are using a laptop, I think it's useful for you to have sort of a plan for how you're going to approach this and to stick to that plan so that you're not left, in November when you look at your class notes from August being like, oh my God, what is this brain dump?
Yeah, I mean, I remember in my early days of basically trying to transcribe what was happening in class and going back through those class notes and just being like, it's like listening to the lecture, but I have no recollection of what was important, because it was too far away. I had too much other information on the page. How could I even tell what the professor thought was important? Because I wrote down everything. Yeah,
and a lot of the stuff, frankly, that other students say, you do not need to be writing down.
Exactly.
It's just not that productive. And this is also a skill. I mean, you might sit through your first couple of weeks of class having absolutely no idea what matters.
And that's totally fine because it's a learned skill and you're going to get better at it as time goes on.
Yeah, but, again, just like you want to walk out of a case, after reading a case, having some idea why you read it, ideally you want to walk out of each class having some idea why the professor was talking about what they were talking about and what you needed to take away from it.
And I think the follow-up to that is if you don't, then you need to go to office hours and get your questions answered. I think one of the things that students tell me is their justification for taking these copious notes on the laptop is that, what if they miss something? Or what if they go back to their handwritten notes and something is confusing? Well, that's exactly the point of office hours. Your professor is going to have set aside time where students can go hang out, ask questions, and you should bring those questions. If you didn't understand something in class, if something got fuzzy in your notes and you couldn't get a good clear answer from a friend or something like that, go talk to the professor. They're actually there to talk to you. That's why they became law professors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is also a place where supplements can be in order. I mean, I don't think you should rely, as I said earlier, on supplements to the absence of reading the cases. But if you've read the case, you've gone to class, and you're still just like, I have literally no idea what is going on here, don't struggle alone. You can go and get a commercial outline. You can get a horn book. There are all sorts of different flashcards and outlines and flow charts, all kinds of things you can basically purchase. While they won't solve all of your problems, they can at least give you kind of that big picture. Okay, this is how these things fit together. This is how these cases fit into it. And I think that's worth doing if you're just like, I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. All right, shall we move on to our next point?
Sure.
All right. We think it's very important to critically evaluate your daily and weekly schedule and make tweaks as necessary. One of the things that I think people think when they start law school is whatever schedule you have determined day one is what you have to stick with for the rest of the time. And that is just not the case. We really recommend that as you go through the weeks of law school that you constantly be evaluating and saying, did I have enough time to do my reading? Did I have enough time to go to the gym? Did I have enough time to go grocery shopping to make sure I have food? Did I find time to review my notes and, answer those questions by going to supplements or going to office hours? You really have to be checking in with yourself, maybe on a weekly basis to see what's working and what's not, so that you can really get into a groove before, if you have midterms, before midterms. And let's be honest, midterms are going to be likely week 7, maybe week 8. By the end of your first month, you better have a pretty good idea of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think it's easy for people to waste a lot of time that they don't realize that they're wasting, which can be really demoralizing. It can be very stressful because if you feel like you're constantly behind. And a lot of this, some people are just frankly have better skills for managing their time than others, but everyone can develop these sort of skills. And, we've talked a lot about the idea that if you're doing work, you need to really be doing work. You want to be focused. If you say that you're doing your reading and you're in the library and you're actually playing Pokemon or on Facebook or whatever, you're not doing work. So you may as well just admit that. And, spend that time actually taking a break versus this kind of combo of 5 minutes of reading, 5 minutes of checking Twitter, 5 minutes of reading, 5 minutes of Instagram, 5 minutes of reading, 10 minutes of getting coffee,
I think another thing that students often forget too is at the beginning of the semester, the workload is actually less than what's coming. So sometimes
scary but true.
It is scary but true. But I think a lot of times students say, well, I'm using every waking hour right now in my second week of law school to do what I need to do. And that's a problem. Because as you get closer to exams, you're going to have to increase the time you spend doing deep thinking tasks, eventually working on outlines, doing practice tests. You're going to have legal research and writing assignments. You're going to have lots of other stuff come up, and you're going to need to be even more efficient. So in these first few weeks, what you want to do is be evaluating and saying, like, oh, that's weird. I feel like my reading is taking twice as long as it should. Maybe I need to figure out what I'm doing. Or, yeah, as Alison was saying, am I wasting time in the library? Am I reading 3 supplements when I really should only be reading 1? Whatever you need to do to say, I want to be busy, but I shouldn't be using every waking hour.
Yeah, I think you've got to use your time intelligently, because no one can study 24 hours a day. You need to sleep, you need to eat, you need to have some time off. And scheduling time off and scheduling exercise and scheduling time with your friends and family, these are all totally valid uses of time. And sometimes you've talked about, treating law school like a job.
Right.
And even actually tracking your time, which if you absolutely hate, maybe the legal profession is not going to be a great fit for you, because you're going to be tracking your life in 6-minute increments pretty much as long as you're a lawyer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you can learn a lot by actually tracking your time, even if, you want to just do it in 15-minute increments, so it won't be so obnoxious. But you do need to evaluate where your hours are going. It is a telling exercise, and there are a lot of online tools that are free that you can even use to track your time for a few weeks to see where your time is going. I think that's actually a good exercise to do in those first few weeks of law school as you're kind of getting into it. Another time waster to watch out for are study groups. We've talked about the pros and cons of study groups at various points on our blog and also on our podcast. But what's important is that you don't all of a sudden find all your free time getting sucked into a study group that maybe not getting you anywhere. So again, you have to evaluate, is this study group actually working for me? Am I learning from it? Or are we sitting around gossiping? Because if you're sitting around gossiping, then it should count as friend hangout time, not study time. And then you have to find that study time somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it can be very useful for certain people to be in a study group. It can also be very useful almost for everyone, really, to have some sort of accountability partner, meaning, whether that's a classmate or a family member or a friend or whatever it is. And it can be, a virtual one. I know friends who are academics who have a Facebook group where they basically, encourage each other, and they commit to working for like an hour, and they announce it in the group, and everyone's like, yay, you're so awesome. And, that could be motivating. And then people, ask them to report back, like, hey, did you actually get that paper written? And they're like, oh, no, whatever happened. But I think having some sort of accountability, and, that's one of the things that's useful to have a tutor for, too, is are you actually doing what you think you're going to get done when you sit down with your schedule on Sunday night or whenever it is? Because if you're not getting the stuff done that you plan to do, then the inevitable question is like, well, when are you going to make this up?
Yeah, and this is something you're going to struggle with all through law school, or most people struggle with, this managing a huge amount of work, and you only get more and more work typically, and more busy as the years go on. And so you do want to figure out, what do you need to be accountable, and then set up that structure. We even have students who have asked us to create monetary accountability. I think Ariel actually wrote on this once. We'll link to it in the show notes, about using tools to basically set goals for yourself. And if you reach your goals, you get to either give yourself money or give money to a charity that you're passionate about. But if you don't meet your goals, then you have to give the money to a charity that you don't believe in, and so, or something along those lines. But it just creates another way of holding yourself to the standards that you've set to yourself. Hey, whatever works. At this point, all we care about is that you are able to get the work done, not necessarily what sort of wacky accountability structure you need.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that a lot of people struggle with, and partly just because the volume of work is so much higher than most people have experienced before, that whatever scheduling skills you had, they're probably going to prove to be not exactly adequate. Like this is going to be one of the big jump ups in ability that people make, in terms of finishing law school, is you're actually just a lot better at getting stuff done because you've had to be for 3 years. So if you're struggling with this, I think the key message is, don't just sort of give up and say, oh, I'm bad at time management. That's not really useful. I mean, some of us are better or worse, but everybody can basically make themselves more efficient and more effective, but you really have to employ these tools and get serious about doing it. And if you don't get serious about it, I mean, the reality is that's when people really crash and burn.
Agreed. And I love hearing, especially from bar studiers, I'm just a procrastinator, so I'm just not going to be able to, I'm just going to get behind. And it's like, no, that just means you have to work harder.
It's like, actually, that's not really no, that's just not valid.
No, it's not like, a disease that you cannot control, or a disability or something that, you have to find accommodations for. It's just that if that's your nature, you have to figure out how to deal with it. And the practice of law, they're not going to feel sorry for you that you don't like to work for deadlines.
Yeah, this is probably not the right career for you if you're really deadline averse.
Yeah. You can't just be like, oh, well, I had a family thing come up this weekend, so I didn't write that brief.
Yeah, the judge is going to be like, okay, then your client's going to go to jail.
Yeah, exactly. Or your partner in your law firm is going to be like, then I'm never going to give you work again. So
yeah, like you're not going to have a job.
You're not going to have a job. So it is.
And I think that's an important point too, is, people often get derailed by these sort of life crises. And, we can all, obviously things happen that are, horribly unpredictable and nothing could be done about them. But a lot of times these sort of like recurring crisis situations are kind of predictable. And the key is you've got to figure out how to deal with this stuff before it happens. So like, what's your social support network? Like, say that you have kids or pets or whatever it is, like, who's going to step in when, the plan shifts? What are you going to do? You can't just sort of like throw your hands up and be like, oh, well, I'll just figure it out. And then, oh, well, I couldn't study for this midterm because of X, Y, and Z. Because your professor's going to be like, I don't care. Yeah,
that's true. If you commute in your car to school every day and you don't have a plan B for when you wake up and your car doesn't start, which has happened to basically everyone I know.
Yeah, someone I heard yesterday, their car got stolen overnight.
Yeah. Stuff happens.
Oh, whoops.
Yeah. So, what's your plan B? You can't just stop going to school. So, who are you going to ask for outlines? Who are your friends in class that are going to help you out? But then how are you going to figure out, the next day or later that day, how you're going to get to school? Whose car can you borrow? Do you have a fund to rent a car? Whatever it might be. Some of this stuff that happens to almost all of us, you've just got to have a plan, and that's something to think about before you get to law school if you're listening to this over the summer, because that's going to really come in handy when that very unforeseen event happens.
Yeah, or getting sick is the other big one. And
Yep.
Obviously, we all get sick. There's nothing you can do about it to some extent. But if you're burning the candle at both ends, you're not sleeping, you're super stressed out, you're eating crap all the time, your odds of getting sick are probably a lot higher.
Yep.
So if you feel like you're not taking care of yourself, that's going to catch up with you eventually. And that's another reason for scheduling in these breaks to rest and recuperate, because otherwise you're not going to be able to get your work done.
Mm-hmm. And that's a big part of it. It's just getting the work done. A big part of it is putting in the hours.
I think that's really one of the keys. Obviously people can be working on the wrong stuff, which is a waste of time. Things like reading the cases multiple times, re-listening to class, crap like that. Stupid, don't do it. But, a lot of it is just showing up every day, making your best effort, working smart, and getting the things done that you need to get done in a timely manner so that you can actually focus on what's going to have the most impact on your grades.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of, let's talk about everyone's favorite first semester thing to complain about, legal research and writing.
Oh, yes, legal research and writing. So it is important that you take legal research and writing seriously, but it has this uncanny ability to take over people's lives your first semester of law school. And I think that's for a few reasons. One is you typically get a number of assignments, and it's really the only class that you're going to get homework assignments. You might have to go research something. You might have a small writing assignment. And it feels good to have work to do that's like checking the box, like I did my assignment. But then students can pour an awful lot of time into those assignments and forget their other classes because it's so tangible what you're doing in legal research and writing. And that's a problem. You really have to think about it as just one, portion of your units. You can only allocate so many hours to it. Another thing we see happen is a lot of students think that they can just blow it off because sometimes legal research and writing is pass-fail, or your assignments in legal research and writing are pass-fail. I think that's a huge mistake. Legal research and writing, of course, is a very important skill, since if you're a lawyer, you need to write for a living. Almost all lawyers write for a living.
And you need to be able to find stuff.
And you got to be able to find stuff online. I mean, they're making all of these legal search engines better and better to help you, but you still have to know how to search and evaluate stuff that you find to see if it's relevant.
As we say in as the programmers say, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, exactly. So you do want to take it seriously. But, you have to get what you can out of it. But I just hate students telling me, I have a legal research and writing assignment, so I haven't done my reading in 2 weeks. Like, that's a huge mistake.
Because professors hate it in their substantive classes when half the class doesn't show up the day that they have a legal research paper due.
Oh, they get so angry.
You want to make sure your professor is not your friend.
Yeah.
Skip class the day that you're whatever is due in your legal research class.
Yeah. Yeah, because
they are going to notice.
Yeah, and you may think it's the hardest thing you've ever seen, but it's so routine for these professors. They're every single year, the students freak out about this legal research and writing assignment. And you just have to remember, look at how many units you're taking. Schools set up their units differently, but it's likely 1/5 of your units.
Oh, and it's often, as you said, pass-fail. If you're spending inordinate amounts of time on a pass-fail class, you're wasting time.
Yeah. So the other thing, though, I would say is if you're going to spend time on it, really try and build a relationship with your professor. If you like your professor, to try and learn from them, because legal writing also can be something that is very frustrating and feels very awkward in the beginning, but you want to get better at it. And so you want to try and get as much feedback as possible. And it sometimes is the only course in law school you will get any feedback on.
Yeah, I think it's very important to take it seriously, but it's also important to realize when you have reached the point of diminishing returns and you're basically using legal writing as a way to procrastinate.
Yes, very good. And we've seen that over and over again. And I saw that with my friends in law school as well.
Yeah, it's just, none of these things are that unusual. If you are listening to this and nodding along and going, oh my gosh, I'm totally doing that. It's not, don't beat yourself up over it. It's just with everything in law school, you've got to really be strategic about how you're spending your time and what you're working on. And so things like paying attention in class, taking good notes, doing the reading, these actually make you more efficient. And then, as we've talked about a lot, you've got to evaluate that schedule, because otherwise you're just not going to have the time that you need to really process this information that you're getting on a daily basis, because the key point is you always got to be thinking ahead towards exams. So even though it's early in the semester, be thinking about how am I going to use this material when it's time to take a test. And it's never too early to think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So like most things, you just have to be very aware. Maybe we need a self-awareness podcast episode. Because,
good idea.
Yes, but you constantly just have to be checking in with yourself and looking for these pitfalls. We all do self-sabotaging behavior, all of us. Allison and I both have our own self-sabotaging behaviors.
Oh, totally, absolutely.
Absolutely. And so, we're not saying that we're perfect or that you shouldn't necessarily, have any of these behaviors that can become time wasters or distract you. But what's really important is acknowledging what they are and catching them before they can really have an adverse effect on your grades. And, and that's all that really is important.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. If you have enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.